Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter. And today I am really excited to be joined by Brigid Russell. Hi, Brigid. How are you?
Hi, Jane. It's brilliant to be here. I'm grand.
That's good. That's good, Brigid. So we're going to talk about some quite exciting matters today, including leadership and spaces for listening. But before we do that, maybe you can tell me a bit about yourself, please, Brigid.
Okay. So I'm Brigid Russell, and I work for myself as a coach, and I do facilitation, team to facilitation, leadership development with groups of people, all in the public sector and third sector, mainly in Scotland, a little bit in England and Northern Ireland. I live in Stirling, and for the last 3 years, I've lived on my own because my husband, Jim, um, uh, died of leukemia just before the pandemic. And yeah, so I've been getting used to living and working on my own here in my house in Stirling.
Thank you, Brigid. And we will talk about Jim as well and grief, because that's one of the things I know actually that you've fallen into
Yeah,
a certain expertise, if that, or your own personal experience,
yes,
and contribute
yeah.
on that. So we'll certainly talk about that too. And it's important, I think, to talk about it because we like to avoid it probably as a topic because it's painful, and yet it's part of the human experience.
Absolutely, and that's essentially, I've had to learn about
Yes.
it. And so that's kind of it's a necessary thing, but it's actually been uh, it's been helpful along the way, if that doesn't sound strange. But yeah, we can say more about
Okay, well, we'll come back to that as we go on. But first, how did you get into leadership and coaching? Because it's kind of a unique sort of expertise in a way. I know some people have it, but how does one become a leadership coach, or why might one
it.
decide to do it?
That's a really good question, and it's really funny because one of the things I do, Jane, is I explore a lot words, and I get kind of caught up in exploring words. And the word that jumped out in your sentence and your question then was expertise, because the older I get, the less I would identify myself as uh, um, as having expertise in leadership, which might sound a bit bizarre. But I kind of fell into it. I fell into both leadership and coaching. And it's funny, actually, I was reflecting the other day, somebody a while ago asked me that question that people ask a lot of, do you wish if you'd known then what you know now, would that have improved things, when you're younger? And I was reflecting on that, and I was thinking, actually, there are things that led to me doing coaching and being involved in leadership that I needed to go through. They might have been really hard at the time, but I don't think I'd have got to where I am now if I hadn't, if that makes sense. So
Mhm.
I started out as a manager in the health service a long time ago. So that was my sort of introduction to working in organizations. And then via doing an MBA, I actually ended up working in management consultancy for a lot longer than I meant to.
Wow, yeah.
That's where I fell into both coaching and a connection with leadership, formally as part of a job, but actually then both became things that interested me more broadly.
Hmm. And then leadership strikes me as something that is extremely relational. Now, maybe not all leaders think or feel in those terms, but would you agree that it's a very relational matter, Brigid?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, kind of linking back to that statement I made about not feeling like I have expertise, the older I've got and the more I work around all things to do with leadership, the less interested I am in leaders as individuals.
Hmm.
And I'm not only, well, I was going to say, and the more interested I am in leadership being something that's relational or process between us. But it's more than interest. It's actually, that's a very strong belief. for me, that actually where leadership really happens is between us, is in the relationships between us. And I've been spending the last few years really questioning some of the sort of prevailing concepts of leadership, which, so the theory in leadership theory, we've supposedly moved away from heroic leadership and
Right.
heroic leader, and yet the prevailing narrative in politics, in media, in lots of organizations is still the heroic leader. They might not, we might not use that language, but it's there, the sort of looking all at the one individual. And as I say, I'm really, I don't think that's where leadership actually happens. I think it's in all of the connections and relationships between us. And that's really, it's hard work, which is what I think the narrative tends to revert to the individual hero leader who's going to come along and sort it all out, rather than actually seeing that where the strength and the potential for addressing all sorts of issues in our organizations and society lie in the collective knowledge, strength, abilities of all of us. And that's why I've described it as I've been having a bit of an existential crisis about leadership in the last few years. And that's why, because I see so much focus put on individual and tend to be senior leaders, when actually I think where the real, sort of, well, some of the potential of innovation, creativity happens in all sorts of connections between people at all levels of the organizations and society.
A leader can, of course, have a vision and perhaps should have some sort of a vision, hopefully a positive one, but they're not going to be able to implement it if their staff on the ground and at various levels don't share it or don't buy into it. And I've seen that myself with people who might have certain kind of heroic or charismatic leadership styles, and then people going, they're trying to do too much, or they're not listening to us, or they're, is consultation as well, or there's lots of words that kind of maybe mean the same things, like co-design and co-production and co-creation. Are those important aspects of leadership, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think those. So again, betraying that what I said earlier about my sort of fascination with the words that we use, because those number of the words you mentioned get bandied about, and we don't spend enough time, I don't think, really exploring what we mean by them, getting behind them and behind the meaning of them, and sharing meanings. So things like co-production, where people are genuinely working in co-production, which is alongside each other, valuing what the contributions that everybody can bring to something, say, I don't know, between a community group and a local service, for example. Genuine co-production would mean we'd be alongside each other and we would really listen to each other. We'd understand what people are looking for from something, and we would value the different strengths and abilities everybody can bring to that. That to my mind is what co-production genuinely. But too often the words get bandied about and they're not really done in that. Because actually some of these things, like co-production, working collaboratively,
hard.
With all of these things, they're really hard. Really, really hard. Because we come to, as groups of individuals, we come to a situation with all sorts of different beliefs, assumptions, hopes, fears, and if we don't surface those and talk about them, then they don't go away. They're lurking.
You're the elephant in the room, sometimes the unspoken.
Yes, exactly. And so, I mean, just reflecting on what we've just been talking about, that's part of the reason why I've become a little bit curious on a good day, fractious on a bad day about leadership, because quite often what I see is people say leaders will leaders need to and actually I think yes, of course, someone who has a leadership role plays a part in all of that, but so does everybody else. And I think if we put too much emphasis on the individual leader, we forget, at risk of forgetting everybody else and what they bring. And the other thing I think that, that was reflecting on when you asked me sort of question one before last, something I've been really curious about is what is it that happens when we come into organizations, that we somehow think leaders need to unleash stuff in other people when
Yeah.
the strengths and abilities and creativities that people have outside of their work, outside of their workplace, what happens to that when it comes when we come into organizations? And so a lot of this, I think, heard some people talk about, perhaps the skill or the potential of leadership is to create the conditions in which people can bring, all of themselves or their best attributes. But actually, it's leaders plus everybody else creating
Yeah.
those conditions together.
That's a really great point because it's something that has come up in these interviews over the last few years. The fact that we do all, to some degree, have to behave in certain ways in the workplace.
Yeah,
We need to, or we feel we need to park bits of ourselves, and maybe we do for good reason. We can't just spill it
yeah,
out. We can't
yeah,
be our 100% authentic selves all the time without hurting other people, maybe, or,
yeah,
just subverting the process. But do you think there is more of a need for us to feel a bit more authentic, a bit more of the time, maybe? Because, for example, before we came kind of clicked record, I was mentioning values to you. We do all have personal values, even if they're not uppermost in our minds and hearts all the
yeah,
time. What
yeah,
if we end up working in a system or for a leader and their vision or the way we have to work then becomes very out of step with our personal values? Does that
yeah,
kind of harm us or make it difficult for us to do our job as best we otherwise might be able to do it?
yeah. There is loads in that, Jane.
Yes.
um, and actually, I guess I'll reflect on it in a couple of ways, and I'll start, a very personal way of reflecting on that. That's what you've described there about how much we bring of ourselves into our work is something that I had been reflecting on for quite a few years. So one of the things that I was involved in a lot between 2018 and until last year was a leadership program with between Scottish Government and NHS Scotland. And the approach that we were using, and myself and co-facilitators in that program, was to encourage all of us to bring all of ourselves into the leadership role. And that was something that I believed in already.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had my own lived experience, if you like, use that expression, of my husband falling ill with leukemia and then dying.
Mm-hmm.
Living with grief in the middle of lockdown and all of that.
Yeah.
And so my exploration was, can I do this work? Can I truly be a coach and be working alongside people, inviting them to bring all of themselves if I'm not bringing all of myself? And what
Wow.
does all of myself really mean when I've have experienced or am experiencing something like that? So I've been exploring that a lot. And so that's the personal side of it. And say, I can say more about that, but then broadening that out to touching on what you've asked, what I've experienced and observed and noticed in the last 3 years is that tension that you talk about between the personal, the professional, the organizational, home values flowing through all of those tensions were there already, of course they
Mm-hmm.
were. But then everybody's lived experience of the pandemic in the last 3 years, and I'm deliberately saying 3 years because it's ongoing.
It's not over.
It has really, I think, really surfaced that, and that I was, obviously I was experiencing it myself, but hearing of it, remotely because all my work was here, online. But hearing it from people in all sorts of roles, in all sorts of walks of life, in health, social care, education, government, local authorities, everywhere, education. That exploration of the boundaries between personal and professional became, in some cases they were already very blurred, but they became really, really blurred, where people were managing their, having to manage their personal and their work lives so differently, so suddenly. So this is a bit of a meandering answer to your question.
My question was quite meandering. No, that's all good. But it's just something, even in the because I'll talk to you as well in a minute about the Spaces for Listening group, and I only attended one. But what I noticed was there was a lot of people from health, and the frustrations as well in doing work that's so important. And I've heard this as well in youth justice and other fields. When the system is such, and the tensions within the system and the pressures and the burdens are real, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's staff retention, sometimes it's sickness, or just managing the threat of the pandemic itself. But what that does to a person, also in, say, mental health and disability services, when children maybe can't access services at the right time, and you then feel you're a cog in the wheel and you're not able to provide the service, like, is it a kind of a wounding is maybe too strong a term, but if you are not part of the solution and become in your own mind maybe part of the problem, is that harmful, or just does it make burnout maybe more likely, or the desire to change, do something easier, maybe, whatever that might be?
So again, there's loads in that, and if it's okay, where I might start in reflecting on that is perhaps to say something about Spaces for Listening and where that
please
came from, but simply because actually I think it illustrates some really powerful examples of what you've just shared. So Spaces for Listening is, I mean, very briefly, what it is a series of one-off online groups of 8 people that come together on Zoom for just under an hour, and it's essentially fairly lightly structured 3 listening rounds that I've been doing for the last 3 years with my friend Charlie Jones. Why I mentioned it is because where that came from was both Charlie and I, in our respective work and personal lives, were noticing at the beginning of the pandemic the fact that so many people didn't really seem to have enough space to listen to each other and to feel heard. And so, very simple but quite profound noticing. And here we are 3 years later, and that still, that probably feels like that even more, I would say. And so the reason I'm mentioning it is because what happens in those spaces, what I observe and experience directly, because I'm in it too, happening, is that it's a little bit of space, and it's not that long, it's 50 minutes, but what people get is a chance to say out loud how they're feeling, what they're thinking about, a whole range of things, and simply to be heard by other people, and then to listen to 7 other people, and people get what they say. And I again experienced this myself, is there's something cathartic, there's something affirming about hearing other people going through things that are similar, not exactly the same, but similar, and that we sit and we listen to each other, and realizing that listening to each other is not, it doesn't provide a solution, but actually there is part of the solution is space to listen to each other and to listen to ourselves. And because something that went through my mind as you were talking about the tensions in systems is, just as the pace quickens up and the systems become even more under pressure, just as that happens, is the irony is we need our connections as human beings and relationships even more. And yet the danger is those are the first things that go. So the relationships get fractured, the connections don't happen because people don't feel like they've got the time to make those connections. And yet where they do, and we see little, I'm not saying Spaces for Listening is therefore the answer to everything, but what we see in those spaces, and what I feel in those spaces, is we all get a little bit of a reminder of, actually can feel really connected to some other people in a very short space of time. What if I could do that more, in a little bit more in my normal workday and in the rest of my life as well, because a lot of people make that reflection about, I could give a few more minutes to stop and really listen to my teenage children are saying, or
Yeah.
my partner is saying, or what my mother is trying to say. I'm sharing all of that, Jane, not with the naive belief that therefore that is the answer to all of the things that you've described. So I think it's got to be part of the answer. Because if I flip that and say, so what is it that stops us really listening to each other and trying to understand how we're all experiencing those tensions in the system? I think what gets in the way is the fear. If I stop and really listen to this, I might not be able to bear listening to it, and I might not be able to do anything. And as you all know, a lot of people who work in all sorts of caring roles carry a huge sense of responsibility to sort stuff out for each other, and feel a sense of failure, I suppose, if they can't. And yet we're all caught in that. And so perhaps there's something about, ironically, as the pace quickens, is there something about slowing down a bit to hear each other and hear ourselves a bit more? Not because that in itself is going to solve it, but actually we probably do have some of the answers between us if we can listen to them more.
Yeah, thank you, Brigid, for that. Because again, I've only attended the one, but I follow you and Charlie on Twitter, and certainly you both write in a very thoughtful and kind of not provocative necessarily, but you pose questions where you and sometimes with lovely pictures of the woods or the sky, and certainly they resonate with me or make me think. But one of the things that strikes me about the spaces for listening is one of my favorite theories is polyvagal theory, and Stephen Porges says that listening is an opportunity for co-regulation, and you don't have to do very much, you don't have to say very much, you're just there. And actually 2 minutes of uninterrupted time is quite long. It's kind of, or you may not know what you're going to say and then surprise yourself. Certainly I wasn't sure what I'd say or what I'd share. And the power of people also being vulnerable sometimes, if you can sit with the discomfort of your own vulnerability and other people's, there's something kind of a bit of lightness that might come, that might set people up for going back to whatever difficulties they're facing. So that was just an observation. But to return to leadership for a second, do you think that leaders recognize the importance of listening? Now, whether it's to ideas or again to, say, the emotional needs of their underlings or their staff, the people who help them bring the vision into the world or whatever it is listening a prized trait among leaders?
Well, so the reason I'm smiling is because one of the things I suppose that I've shifted how I would describe it in the last few years is, and you might see in some of my tweets, I am quite provocative about leadership, actually. And it is because I think what you just described, I think we all need that, whether you're a leader or not. But actually, yes, leaders need it too. And that is really listening. So listening sometimes listening without an agenda, or if you are listening with an agenda, being clear about what that agenda is, being open about it. So just dipping back to a word you used a while ago, which was around consultation. I have a real bee in my bonnet about where people use, this, say we're going to go out and speak to people, and actually what they're doing is a formal consultation, which is quite different from really getting alongside people and listening to them. So yes, I think anyone who's in a leadership role needs to be able to and prepared to listen to people, and really, at times to listen with, at all times to listen with curiosity, but also to be, perhaps what it goes with is a couple of other things, some real honesty about, so am I listening here, but I've already got an answer, so actually answer. So be clear about that. Or if I'm genuinely coming along to listen because we might be formulating I might want to formulate some answers with you, then listen with real curiosity and listen for longer, because the answers will be there in the collective intelligence of groups of people from all places. So not just people who might work in your team or organization, but people who are accessing the services that you
Yes.
context, or community groups. And so again, if I flip that, so because I sort of think, why would people not do that? Like that, that makes sense, doesn't it? So why they don't, or what might get in our way is, or everybody's way, is the fear perhaps, or concern about what I might hear. People might ask for things that we can't
Yeah.
do. But there's something about, can we get past that fear? Because actually, if they do have some expectations or ideas that we can't act on, they're still going to be there whether we listen to them or
That's
not.
right.
Actually, better to listen to them, and then to have the frank and open conversation about what we all believe. And that comes back to your point about values. I think we kind of avoid uh, sometimes avoid listening, or avoid the really open conversations, because we're feared, as they would say in Scotland, of what might come out of that.
Mm.
But actually, let's explore if we can explore the differences of view and values, maybe we might actually find more common ground.
One way where this kind of came up for me and our team recently was we're looking at interventions for young people who are kind of being enticed or coerced into criminal networks, and
Okay.
they're often drug dealing networks. And many people with kind of lived experience or community experience who we invited to a group were saying, well, criminalization and prohibition is part of this problem.
Yeah.
It occurs within this massive market, and
Yes.
the policy is actually contributing to these young people's vulnerability and the money that's being made by gangs. On the other hand, we had no immediate power to be changing that law, but
Yes.
if we hadn't reflected that we heard it, I felt my values would have actually been kind of
Yeah.
a bit impacted, because it was important to hear it as part of
Yes.
the reality. Um,
Absolutely.
is that one of the reasons, again, to talk about the kind of lived experience, or if you're trying to improve community safety, let's say, that you've got to go to the people who are actually living in the community and involve them in a meaningful way in the process?
Yeah. So again, if I can answer that question, or kind of approach it from a couple angles. So when I was doing the leadership program that I mentioned, one of the things that really struck me there was a lot of the dilemmas that people who are in leadership roles in statutory organization sector will say is, oh, we really want to engage with the community, but we don't, we don't know how to do that or where to start. And so that's over here somewhere. And then during the pandemic, one of the things is, I spend far too much of my life on Twitter, but it's actually really helpful because I've met people, and that's what's led me to be much more connected to the third sector, and met people like Shamila Ahmed, who I
Yeah,
know
amazing.
through all sorts of connections on Twitter. And so I've spent quite a lot of time with her and her colleagues in Resilience Learning Partnership. And what I was hearing there was people saying, we really would like to engage with statutory services, but we're sort of kept at arm's length, or we're not. That's not quite true, but we're sort of, how do we do that? And it really strikes me that we sort of set up these, because actually the work I'm doing with RLP is around exploring having a leadership program or pathway for people with lived experience. And one of the challenges Shamila and I have been talking about is actually, how do we bring these things together? Because actually, if we develop in separate streams, then guess what? We probably end up working in separate streams. So how can we come together in some, not common ground, as actually some ground in which we can actually explore our similarities and differences? And sorry, this is a very long-winded answer to your question, but all of that reflection over the last 2 or 3 years has made me think made me challenge myself about where we start is really important, and the assumptions that we make and the language we use says so, actually reveals so much
Yeah.
unintentionally sometimes. So when someone who works in the health service says, how do we consult with that community? It's like their starting point is here with my professional view of this. And I
Yes.
understand that. I'm not judging it. I
Mm.
understand it. But it's actually, how can we all stand back from where we and notice where we are starting from?
Hmm.
And as I say, not do that in a kind of punitive or self-blaming or other blaming way, but actually just notice that. And
Yeah.
then, so how actually could we get around the proverbial table in a different way? How can we start the conversation in a different way? And that's it's one of my current areas of real interest of uh, not that spaces for listening is the answer to that, but actually the experience that people get, the very pure experience in the sense of listening to all sorts of different people there, is possibly something that then enables, or would be, feels like it's a core essential part of other work we might then go and do with each other, where we've really listened to each other as human beings first and foremost. Because as you know, in spaces for listening, we don't do any introductions, so people
Hmm.
arrive on a Zoom screen and all they know is each other's names. And what that elicits is really interesting, is real curiosity about what people do, but it gets rid of, or at least it perhaps parks the judgment people might make about, oh, that person's a social worker, that person's a
Yeah.
GP, person's a community worker, whatever. Um, that could come later. So there's something about how we can meet each other in a different way and have different kinds of conversations.
Yeah, as you were talking there as well, restorative practice just popped into my head because um,
Yeah,
it has also scope for, I guess, equalizing a little bit, when there might be varying roles or age groups within a
yes,
room or ethnic
yeah,
backgrounds or anything like that. And even the talking and listening piece, it gets rid of the capacity for interruption. And I'm a key offender there myself at times, wanting to butt in or
yeah,
even the drifting off when sometimes that you're coming. And of course you can bypass it if you don't want to do it. But I think as well in fractious groups where there are tensions or where maybe people don't like each other or think they're going to be attacked, it allows the conditions to be a little bit just calmer somehow. Is my sense, and in fact,
yes,
I've started using it with some families now, where the family dynamic in one of our projects is such that they can't really get into conversations without this conflict. So by
yes,
having the cup as the indicator, you don't have the 2 minute timer, but you're
yeah,
not allowed to be blurting out your points of
yeah,
view. And of course, with status and leadership, leaders' voices always carry more weight, and I'm wondering, and it goes back to maybe your point about Jim and the grief and the change in your personal circumstances and vulnerability. And is it okay for leaders to, I mean, clearly they are vulnerable. We're all vulnerable at times,
yes,
but is it okay to show vulnerability at times? Or when we're inviting in vulnerability from others, is it
yes.
okay that we also admit our own vulnerability, do you think?
Yeah, and again, there's
100 million
so
questions.
many threads in that. No, I mean they're all, and I'm just trying to think where to start. So there's a word that I just have to say because it's kind of floating around in all of this, and it's floated around in all of so many of the conversations I have with Shamila, which is power.
Hmm.
So with leadership comes power, but with all sorts of roles with professional roles comes power. And so there's something, and again, that I think, so one of the things that living with grief has done for me is to feel able to be um, much more open and much more bold, much more open about how I am feeling. And because some days I just have
Yeah.
to do that. but also a sort of boldness in what I'm prepared to say, including I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
That's a
when you
novel
say,
one, all right.
yeah, yeah. So when you say about vulnerability, is that essential for people in leadership roles? I think what's essential in all of this is our humanity, and that's what we find time and time again in spaces for listening. Is people will say, I mean, I experience it, but others have said it really compellingly about you get a kind of sense of shared humanity because what we're able to do is just listen to each other as different people with all sorts of different backgrounds, different walks of life, but some really strongly shared experience, very shared human experiences. If I then bring that into what you were talking about where groups might be coming together and it's fracture, I suppose what I've been reflecting over the last couple of years is what I notice is in lots of organizations, what we end up doing is trying to make those fractious meetings or groups. We try to put too much control around it. We try to make it safe in inverted commas. And I've written down here overly sanitized. And what I mean by that is, oh my goodness, there's people with different views and we better kind of control how we we need to hear them, but we better control how that happens. That might not be overtly said, but that's kind of there in process. And I get that. I understand why people feel the need to do that. But the downside of that is, or the reality of that is, there's all sorts of power and control in that. Who's deciding whose voices matter most? There's all sorts of unwritten things in that. But if the other extreme is, what we sometimes see perhaps on social media as people talk about is a free for all of views from all over the place, and we end up in a different way, being really polarized. And I suppose what I'm really interested in is, because I think we need to be having far more really genuine, open dialogue about all sorts of issues that you've touched on, is how can we come together with that discomfort? Sometimes it will feel really uncomfortable, with enough structure that actually doesn't sanitize it, but makes it safe enough for people to speak and feel that they're going to be heard, but to let go of some of the control, because the power manifests itself in some judgments that get made. So this, Jamila and I have talked about this a lot, where somebody who perhaps has been given, has got the lived experience label, if they express something really in a really heartfelt way, described as angry and out
Tone
of control.
policing.
Yes. Whereas someone who is in a formal professional role might, how they're expressing themselves might get described as something else. So there's all sorts of, and I'm kind of not describing that particularly well, but you know what I mean? There's all value judgments that float around, sometimes, subconsciously, unconsciously. But there's something about how we can, as safely as possible, surface that, but allow there to be between us, allow be a different kind of conversation. And some of the things like you described of gently managing how interactions happen to enable there to be that openness rather than to control it or to close it down. And I think that comes to a deep-seated fear that we all have, to varying degrees, of fear of conflict. And yet the conflict, the biggest thing that I suppose I've come to realize in the last few years is that as I've said in this call, the conflict doesn't go away, it just goes underground.
Yes. The other thing is, I think if we can tolerate the discomfort, it enables us then to actually feel the other person and their perspective a bit better, and then actually get where they're coming from a bit more. If you can, but you use the word as well, notice, a few times, and I know mindfulness and all of that is quite popular, and certainly I've become very interested in yoga, and a lot of it is about noticing the sensations. I'm wondering, do leaders or do any of us actually, unless you start noticing and kind of going, oh my God, my heart is pounding,
Yes,
my stomach now is in a knot, I'm really
yes,
uncomfortable here. That if we
yes,
don't notice that and take the breath, we're way more likely to shoot our mouths off in a hurtful way when threatened. Whereas
yes.
if we can again become aware of our energy, the energy in the room, and just kind of try and sit with it, or if we need to leave to have a
To
breather.
have a time out, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Are
And
those kind of things coming up in leadership or even in, I imagine with Shumela and certain groups, there's an awareness. And even the
yes,
Scottish government, maybe, Scotland is ahead of the curve in many ways, I think. But are leaders tuning into that, the kind of how our emotions can actually at times derail collaboration, but it's not that they're unimportant.
yes, exactly. And so much in that. And you mentioned Shamila, and that was going through my mind as you were talking, Jane, which is so I think there is a lot that we can all learn from trauma-informed practice. And so I have learned a lot from Shamila and her team in the last, 2, 3 years. I'd say it was a real privilege to be working alongside them. Because all of the work they do with others, but that they do themselves, means it's not about ignoring the trauma or trying to get past it or to manage it in a very controlled way. It's actually noticing it, acknowledging it for ourselves, and then and for each other, and then doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And she and I have talked about that quite a lot, and that links to something you asked me a while ago about, so my own experience of grief. What So I wouldn't have called myself, I wouldn't have called myself someone who does mindfulness practice as such, but I kind of have
Mm-hmm.
had to in the last 3 years. So, but I think the key thing here is for each of us to find a way that works for us, rather than that be imposed,
Sure.
this. And that, again, I'm sort of dancing around, but something that really noticed in the last few years, the first year of the pandemic in particular, lots of organizations with, in a very well-meaning way, put in lots of stuff around well-being,
Yeah.
point where that word well-being became a bit, like resilience,
Yeah.
has a sort of shadow side to it. But for me, the key thing is acknowledging the importance of understanding ourselves, our own, motivations, triggers, stresses, strains, as you said, noticing the sort of physical side of that in order to manage our own emotions and interactions with others, not to suppress those
Mm.
emotions at all, but actually so that we can feel more effective in the moment. And for me, how I've done that in living with grief is walking has been the thing. So you mentioned
Mm.
my that's because I take those photographs when I have done the same walks many times in the last 2 3 years. I wouldn't impose that on anyone else. It really, really works for me for all sorts of reasons, and has been a lifesaver actually in many ways.
Yeah. And in terms of just the grief there and how, of course, it's changed you, it's changed your life, the loss of Jim and the working from home, essentially a lot on your own.
Yeah.
It's been certainly a journey for you. What have you learned along the way? What are some of the key things that, whether positive or negative or kind of ambivalent in the growth and discomfort and pain of all of that?
Yeah, well, so the particular I suppose inquiry that I've been doing, which is an ongoing one, which is um so grief will mean different things to each of us. The obvious one is the grief for the person. So I miss Jim as a person, of course I do. But the bit that was a big realization for me, and it's still there, is our life together as well.
Mhm.
So for our life together and what he brought to our life together. and he was a huge part of my reflective process,
Okay.
and knew he was a singer and a songwriter and a musician, so did very, very different work from me. But his insights into the work I do was incredibly helpful. And I did know that when he was here. I did know that he was a big part of my reflective process, but I wouldn't have described it in
Yeah.
that way. So what I've had to do is to find another way of understanding that, and being okay with the aloneness of not being with that one person, and then all sorts of other connections that I've needed to make, that not to replace it. I nearly said replace it. Nothing can replace it, but actually to find another way.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Thank you for that. And to go back to leadership again, I interviewed a guy called Jim Sporleder before. I don't know if you've seen the movie Paper Tigers, but it's about a trauma-informed high
Oh,
school.
okay.
A really
Right.
good one. So by the same guy, Jamie Redford, who made Resilience. But he actually told me he kind of broke down after the making of the movie because he'd been so busy creating this trauma-informed environment for his students and holding the staff,
Yeah.
and you know, really he was a man on a mission, and everyone bought into the mission, but he was the leader and he didn't have a mentor. He didn't really have people to share
Mhm.
his
Yeah.
emotions and fears with. Is that, do you think, again, a common issue for leaders, that they can, is it like the shadow side of power, maybe, that I can't be weak, that I can't, you know, I can't talk about my confusions or doubts. And
Yeah.
perhaps women are better at that in general, you know, in just the that, and again, it's a gender stereotype, but we're slightly more encouraged to reflect on emotions and that type of thing. But I imagine some female leaders also may not have the have the people there. And Pauline Scott, for example, has told me that she has created, you know, a support network for her.
Yeah.
Is it important for leaders or whoever it is that's doing heartfelt, challenging, um just stressful work, to have
Yeah.
someone, whether it's a gym or a team or a group of
Yeah.
friends or a professional network, to
Yeah.
support and hold?
So the simple answer to that is yes. And then I think what I would add to that, Jane, is this kind of, I suppose, reiterate the point I made a little while ago about, and to do that in a way that works for you.
Yeah.
And but to, as a leader, as with anyone, to have to really know where do you get different kinds of support and restoration, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
and and to be able to be, as I mean, Pauline actually is an example of someone who's very open about that. I think that openness, I think there's, again, going back to something we touched on a while ago, I think there's a lot more, at least in theory, there's a lot more acceptance that as leaders, people, they can be open about their own uncertainties, their own doubts, their own need for support. But I said that sort of deliberately in theory, because I think a lot of rhetoric is said about that, but the reality is perhaps
Mm-hmm.
still not caught up with that, which is that, you know, I mean, it used to be said, for example, with coaching, people would say, oh, if, I think this has really changed, but culture in some organizations used to be that if you had a coach, somehow that was, that there was a weakness, or,
Yeah.
seen as remedial. And that has definitely changed. But I think there's a way to go in saying it's okay to share how you are if you happen to be in a leadership role, and for that, and to be human in that. And it doesn't then mean that you're making it all about you.
No.
It's actually that, in a sense, what you're doing is acknowledging um your own human fragility alongside everybody else. But the key thing for me in reflecting on what you've just asked is that each of us is able to find be aware of how we need to be supported, and
Mm-hmm.
to provide that support for ourselves, and to seek it out and to do it regularly.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of the interview, and we've covered um an awful lot of it. I'm just wondering, do you think, like, do we all have the potential to be leaders, or are some people just intrinsically more suited to the task than others?
Well, I think how I'd answer that is, not to sound like I'm dodging it, but what I'd go back to is what we were talking about earlier about leadership rather than leader roles. I'm
Right.
much more interested in how do I think that we all at times bring leadership into what we do? Then yes. Um, but how leadership actually happens is what I am much more concerned about and much more want to challenge, which is that leadership is not the big figurehead.
Hmm.
Leadership might be all sorts of quiet things that happen gently in the background in the interconnection between all of us. And so in that respect, I think all of us can be involved in leadership, but I might even call it something different. I might
Hmm.
call it collaboration and connection rather than leadership. So kind of dodged your question, Jane.
No, I mean, I like that too, and it makes perfect sense given the fact that you want us to move away from the august figurehead to this
Yeah,
co-creation, really, of
yeah,
better ways and more kind of more fitting
yeah,
methods for whatever the task is, because obviously
yeah,
they're different, and different
yeah,
people need to feed into it. I'll just ask you one final question, Brigid, if I
yeah,
may. And I kind of asked this one to everyone really as a sort of conclusion. What do you think politicians and policymakers can do to kind of promote safe, healthy relationships in childhood and across the life course? Because I think this is also relevant to our capacity to collaborate and to listen and to relate well.
yeah.
Any ideas?
So I think it kind of connects to the notions around Cormac Russell and all of the work around asset-based community development. I think that's what came into my mind when you were talking about when you asked that question, which is recognizing the strengths and the capabilities and qualities that people have in themselves and in their communities, and to value the importance of relationships wherever they are. And yeah, because what that does is I think it sort of challenges prevailing notions of power and expertise and privilege. But I think it's about recognizing the real intrinsic value of good relationships wherever they are.
Okay. Thanks so much, Brigid. I've really enjoyed our chat today.
Yeah, me
Thanks so
too.
much for making the
Thank you.
time. So, everyone, this has been Relationships Matter with me, Jane Mulcahy, and the wonderful, inspiring Brigid Russell. Thanks so much for tuning in. Okay.